Hi, guys. Thank you so much for being here today and joining us for our Reef Chat on the ocean influence on the climate, excuse me, with Dr. Mickey Rogers and Nilanjana Das. Did I say that right? Okay, awesome. And then a little bit about Dr. Mickey Rogers. She's an atmospheric chemist and was most recently a research fellow at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, where she held a novel nature-based carbon capture research on airborne algae to unravel the complexity interactions between ocean and climate. And Ms. Nilanjana Das is a Corvallis-based interdisciplinary artist and Ph.D. student in microbiology at Oregon State University. Thank you so much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Yay. Thank you. So we're gonna split this up a little bit. I'm gonna kick us off with some of the ocean climate nexus background, some of the work that I've led, and then I'll pass it over and we can have a great chat about the art that Nilly has done as well. So let me just turn this on and then, oh, I just realized I don't remember how to like share in Google Sheets. Um, the
Um, I
presentation.
think if you do slideshow, you can try and then see with the space bar if it changes the slide. Sometimes that works, sometimes
Oh,
it
yeah.
doesn't. So we can just test it out and see.
Okay, cool. I think that this is good. All right, everyone. So, yes, thank you for that introduction. My name is Mickey Rogers, and my background is atmospheric chemistry, which is the total opposite of the ocean and especially the deep sea. But I worked on connecting the ocean and the climate nexus, and so that's a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. And Nilly and I are both a part of this organization called Sustainable Ocean Alliance, which is also a part of this Reef Chat series. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that as well. Today we'll be focusing on from sky to sea, and then I'll talk about that chemistry, and I'll bring it back from that to sea back to the sky, so we can have this full circle story today. So for those of you who aren't familiar on the call, there is a lot of CO2, carbon dioxide, in our atmosphere. So I'm starting with the atmosphere and I'm going to take us down to the ocean together. So this carbon dioxide that is naturally released from plants and anthropogenically released from emissions, from greenhouse gas emissions, industry, different processes like that. This gas can dissolve into the ocean. And when it's dissolved into the ocean, phytoplankton, or my area of expertise, microalgae, these little guys can consume the CO2 through photosynthesis, and they can uptake the CO2. And after that process, and there's like a fun little diagram over here. So imagining these little creatures like nomming up the little CO2, and then the algae, the little green guys here, are going to be eaten by other predators like the zooplankton, and then it just keeps going down the line. And eventually, at some point, the beautiful circle of life happens, and these sea creatures have to pass on. And so, while they're full of the carbon that was once in the atmosphere and has dissolved into the water, the carbon will eventually fall down into the bottom of the sea as marine snow, and it'll eventually be buried in the sediment at the bottom of the water in the seabed, where the carbon will be sequestered for thousands of years. So this is one of the ways that we consider the ocean to be one of the greatest carbon sinks on the planet, because it pulls that CO2 from the atmosphere and eventually gets sunk down to the seabed where it stays for a very long time. So I wanted to give a little bit of background behind myself about why I care about this kind of ocean climate nexus and taking an understanding from the atmosphere all the way down to the ocean. So I'm from Ohio originally. I grew up along the Lake Erie coast, where I was surrounded by seeing harmful algal blooms during the summer. And I was always really fascinated by these harmful algal blooms. I would think about how the water would change colors. There would be interesting smells during this time. And I would do something called catfish throwdowns with my dad. We would go and catch catfish and just see how many we could catch at a time. And I would see dead fish on the coast during different types times of the year. And so I didn't understand what was happening as a kid, but eventually led me to Ohio State, where I wanted to understand kind of this water algae nexus. And I ended up joining a group that studies aerosols, which I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the aerosols are particles in the atmosphere, in the sky. I like to think of water, like the Great Lakes or the ocean, as the largest can of spray paint on the planet. Waves will constantly be pushing aerosols into the atmosphere. That's why you can smell toxic algae when you go by lakes, or you can smell the salt water when you go by the sea. So I joined this aerosol chemistry group at Ohio State, and it led me to thinking about this relationship between our atmosphere and our waters and our what is inside the waters. When I was in graduate school, my research funding came from the National Science Foundation, and it was a part of this organization called Center for Aerosol Impacts on Chemistry of the Environment. So I was trying to understand this relationship of aerosols, these atmospheric particles, and how they connected to different parts of the environment. In particular, I was trying to relate atmospheric particles and bodies of water. And thinking about that interesting time as a kid, seeing the green algae everywhere, wondering what was happening to the fish, I wanted to bring algae into this consideration. And it led me to studying something called airborne algae. So I'm showing you some pictures here of an aerosol. So this blue kind of circle that has like squiggly things in the middle of it, that's a particle that is, or a droplet that is floating around in our atmosphere. And it's filled with different things that could be coming from the water. I wanted to understand how algae from the water could potentially get up into the air, if that was even a possibility. So what I'm showing here on the left is just an aerosol. There's stuff inside of it, and it's very small in size. So it's less than 2.5 microns in size, and that is significantly thinner than a strand of hair, just to give you some context. The next picture that I'm showing you is what algae looks like. Algal cells are very small. They're in that similar size range of a of aerosol or this atmospheric particle that's floating around that has been emitted from the ocean. And it can fit inside of an aerosol. So I wanted to understand, could these algae be in the air? There are also really big aerosols too that are greater in size, so the widths of a couple strands of hair. And so as algae can grow in size, it could even be in these larger aerosols that are floating around. And so the reason I wanted to understand this relationship between algae and the atmosphere and water is because I saw these changes of algal blooms over time. I saw the water quality changing over time. And so I had this question is about if the water quality is changing over time, can the air change over time too? So if none of that made sense, I'm going to walk you through what it even means to be an aerosol and take you through this process. So I'm showing you here kind of a schematic of the it could be either the ocean or the Great Lakes. And this green line that I'm showing you here is this interface between a body of water, such as the ocean, and the atmosphere. And so we know that algae is something that grows in the water. And so it's not normally found in the air until I've been doing research. So it's something that exists below. And these particles here that I'm kind of showing, the red with the white dots, those are representing kind of water molecules. There's some other squiggly bits that are at the top of the ocean. Those are representing just other things that might be coming from the ocean that eventually come up and kind of concentrate along the surface of the water. But what I want to talk about is how we talked about in the beginning, kind of like algae could eventually die. There's the circle of life where the material in the water can eventually come to its end of life. When that happens, some of these materials sink down to the bottom of the ocean and get sequestered in sediment, kind of like I mentioned. But some of these materials can also come up to the surface of the water. It kind of just depends on different chemistries in the material. And so when this happens, this green line here, which I talked about as the interface or the different phase between the water and the air, it can be comprised of lots of different material that is coming from bodies of water. In this case, I'm talking about the ocean. When waves crash and form, if you've ever gone by the ocean and you've smelled that salty air that I've kind of talked about, when waves crash and form, it sprays particles, mist into our atmosphere. And that mist is actually an aerosol. And so, whatever material has been concentrated at this green line or at the surface of the water, that material is what eventually sprays up into our atmosphere. So, if there's algae sitting at the interface between our ocean and the atmosphere, the air above it, waves can actually spray algae up into the air in these things called aerosols. And so that was the research question that I wanted to explore so I could understand this relationship between the water and the atmosphere. And the reason that all of this connects to climate, I'm going to show you a new kind of schematic, but I want you to focus on kind of the information up here. So, the aerosol that has algae in it is called a primary biological aerosol particle. So it has a biological material inside that particle that's floating. And some of the things that relate to climate that we care about is these particles that get kicked up in the air, these aerosols, they can actually reflect the sun. So that's kind of represented. Are you guys able to see my cursor here? Is that
Yes.
working? Okay, great. So these particles that get kicked up in the atmosphere, sprayed by waves, they can actually reflect the solar radiation from our atmosphere. So they can act as like little dots in our atmosphere and just the light hits it and then bounces right off of it back up into the sky. So that's something that relates to the climate. These particles can also act as seeds in our atmosphere in which a cloud can grow from or ice can grow from. And so these particles that are floating around in our atmosphere that originate from the water, whether it be the ocean or bodies of like the Great Lakes or ponds, these put the seeds in the atmosphere that clouds can grow from or ice can, what we call nucleate from, and that can dictate weather patterns. And then the last thing that I'm showing you here is this red, black, and red compound. This is carbon dioxide. So there's a carbon in the middle and then two oxygens on both sides. These particles that have algae in them can also consume the CO2 in the atmosphere. So we talked a little bit about how algae in the water can take up carbon dioxide, but now I recently discovered in my last role that when algal particles are in the air, they can also consume carbon dioxide. And so that's a new source of interaction between these ocean or Great Lake cells and our atmosphere. And so basically, what this can mean is that this new source of carbon dioxide sequestration can be put then into climate models to better understand our CO2 regulation on the planet. So I know that was really heavy, and I kind of want to stop right there to see if there might be any questions real quick because that was like pretty technically dense. And if not, no worries. Hey, Nicole, I see your hand. Oh, I see many hands. Sorry, I couldn't see you at first, and now everyone's back, so
Are you able to hear me okay?
yes.
Okay. So a few years ago, I was in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and I specifically went there to spend time on the beach. But the surf had crashed up a whole bunch of algae bloom, and it was all in the air as aerosols. And when you walked on the beach, you were choking and your eyes were
Ah.
burning. It was in the air, you couldn't breathe. So we couldn't enjoy the beach. So on that day, I felt like algae in the air was a bad thing. But now I'm hearing from you that algae in the air can be a good thing.
Yeah, no, that is a really great point. And I try to like fight for the little guy because most algae is really good. So according to NOAA, 99% of algae is non-toxic, non-harmful to humans. And so 1% of this microalgae, or like if you are familiar with cyanobacteria, this is like the toxic algae. And it just gets like a really bad rep basically. The toxic algae just explodes because of fertilizer runoff down in Florida or other nutrient runoff from farms like in the Pacific Northwest. And so we just hear about that algae in the air because it's doing harm to humans. We don't really hear about the good algae in the air that's like making clouds and regulating our weather patterns because well, it's not as much of a direct impact to the humans. But yes, there's good algae out there that's like helping to regulate our entire climate.
And so you're saying now that in climate models, they should be factoring in some kind of mathematics that accounts for the amount of CO2 that algae in the air takes out.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So this is a very recent finding that I found. I have just transitioned roles, but I found at the end of my position, I was at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory before this. And yeah, there's like no full mathematical understanding of one, how much algae gets into the air, and two, to what extent algae can kind of take the kind of capture the CO2 from the air, and if there's a variance in can some algae do it better than others. So this is basically just a very first finding of answering the question, can algae sequester or utilize basically CO2 in the air? And the answer is yes. So we have just like crossed off the very first question. So there are many unknowns from here. Cool. I see two more hands. I don't know. Someone go.
I'll go. I thought that was incredibly well explained. Thank you so much. I'm curious because I heard once on an allergies podcast that fungal spores can like migrate intercontinentally in air currents. Is that also a thing for aerosolized algae?
Yeah, that is totally true. So I've also done some work with aerosolized fungal spores, aerosolized bacteria. I did a lot of specifically like pollen work, aerosolizing pollen to understand that migration as well. But yes, the short answer is yes. The long answer is we don't fully understand this because algae in the air is the least studied biological aerosol. We put a lot of focus on things like viruses, especially after COVID, because that has a lot of human impact, kind of like Nicole was pointing out, like, oh, I've heard about the bad algae in the air because that impacts us. Um, but basically, the reason why this is even on the scientific radar is they have found algae in really remote parts of Antarctica, like on the snow. And they're like, how did that get there? It's like nowhere near the water. And so the idea is it must have traveled in the air. And so we expect, given certain weather patterns, like during a monsoon or like a hurricane, these things can just like fly through the air hundreds of miles. But we don't fully understand the full extent of how these little guys like travel and how far they can travel, and also depending on kind of their density and size, it may be more or less distance. So the answer is yes, but we don't really understand why or how.
That is fascinating. Okay, Megan, go ahead.
So, do you see a future where we can seed the atmosphere with some of this algae to remove carbon? Because, baby, I'm there if that's what you're seeing.
I love this question, and I know that like geoscience is a really like geoengineering is like a really scary place. Like people are really freaked out by cloud seeding, and I know that a lot of people think like in Texas, the flooding could be associated with the cloud seeding work that has been done there. So there's a lot of controversial thoughts behind this. I do a lot of work in the marine carbon dioxide removal space, so MCDR. And so there's talks of like new technologies to do carbon dioxide removal versus nature-based approaches to doing carbon dioxide removal. And my big dream, my pie in the sky thought was like algae everywhere in the sky, just like sequestering this carbon and helping to reduce the CO2 and rebalance the planet. I don't know if that makes sense because the only question I've answered is can airborne algae consume CO2? And that's where we're at right now. But maybe in an ideal world, if it doesn't just completely, mess up other weird chemistries that are very important to our planet, we would have to do a lot of research before embarking on something that seems as scary as like the geoengineering in the sky. But that would be my hope. That was the initial hope.
Yeah. Have you done any studies as to the types of algae that can go airborne, toxic versus non-toxic?
This is a really great question. So I picked one happy little algae that was non-toxic to me. So it was like an easier thing to get approved funding wise. It's called chlorella, and it's just a little perfect circular little guy that can get up in these little perfect circular little aerosols. And it's pretty well studied for other reasons, just like through ecology lens or through like even the industrial biofuel lens. So I started with this one. And it's just well documented and it had the physical morphology to potentially be able to be aerosolized. And so I've only answered this question with one guy, and there are millions of algae, microalgae in the world. I love all these questions. I think I saw maybe Isabel next. I'm not sure.
Hi. Yes, I know I keep raising it, lowering as you're saying more. And I think my questions are so abstract. I was not wanting to take time from other people that were so focused, but I'm really excited to see this and learn about this and wondered if you, when you were at the National Labs, my good high school friend, Stephen Gann was,
Oh, he has been a
very-
mentor to me for the last couple of
yeah,
years. I
I
love
thought
Stephen.
so. Yeah,
Yeah, so I was at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is in
right.
Washington State. I was there for the last 3 years. I recently just moved to Washington, D.C. to embark on the science policy nexus. I'm working at the
Cool.
Department of Energy. I'm not representing myself as a DOE person right now. Everyone, please note that. But yeah, so I worked at PNNL for the last 3 years and worked with Stephen extensively through other climate advocacy work with an organization called Citizen
Sure.
Climate
Oh,
Lobby.
you worked on that? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Very much
very
in touch
active.
with him. Yeah. He's retired from the labs, but yeah. And I'm also involved with the University of Washington Marine Science Research Station
Okay.
here on Friday Harbor
Yeah.
lab. And there's some algae people I'm hoping to get in touch with there. So this is kind of a primer for me to begin learning about what to ask. Because I guess when you hear thrown out, and I've actually seen talks about this, about algae being a climate solution to removing CO2 from the ocean, but
Yeah.
and whether that's, playing with nature too much or whatever. I mean, is that a focused enough question to get some thoughts from you on that? And I'm not really sure if you know anybody here. Well, I mean, I know who they are. I just have to go meet them and ask. But I feel
Yeah.
like I want good questions if I go talk to them.
That's a really good question. And I will say, so in the MCDR, the marine carbon dioxide removal world, where people are trying to figure out nature-based versus technology-based, like carbon dioxide removal technology, the dream is like, yeah, we hope seaweed and mangroves could be enough to do that, but we just don't think that they're enough to do that. And so we're definitely going to need some technology to support these nature-based methods. So my dream of algae up in the air, making little clouds and doing whatever, that's not going to be enough to combat our climate crisis, unfortunately. Um, I will say that there's a lot of research, especially at the national labs and in the private sector, that people are trying to do iron fertilization, which is something that some of you may have heard of before, but just like trying to increase the amount of phytoplankton in the water just by feeding them with the iron so that they can just like grow more and algal blooms can be way more productive. So that's
Yes,
something that people are definitely working on. But I think the consensus right now is that nature-based solutions might not are likely not going to be enough to combat our climate crisis.
got it.
Yeah. Roxanne?
Thanks. Yeah, I was curious if the aerosolized algae, like once it captures the CO2, do you know what happens to it? Like if it's over land, does it just like fall on the ground?
This is a really great question as well. So, my like last day at PNNL, I was able to like measure these like tiny like parts per billion differences in like oxygen production. So it was taking in the CO2, doing photosynthesis and making oxygen. So the only question I can answer is like, yes, it does photosynthesis in the sky. I don't have any answers after that. But what I do know is that I've heard from people when I've talked about this airborne algae idea that like wild grad students in Florida used to just like stick their hands out the window with petri dishes and drive around and try to collect like these particles, and then algae would start growing on them. So like they must have been, kicked up and then fell back down like through weather patterns. So they come down eventually. They don't stay in the air, but I don't know how long, and it just depends on many things, I suppose. Cool. I have a couple more slides to talk about the advocacy work, the things I do beyond the lab to kind of like make this more relevant. I hope we're not too bad on time. But I just wanted to say I got really bored during the pandemic, and it led me to wanting to do more with my science. So I was in my third year of grad school, and I was mostly just writing at that point, and I got bored, and I was like, I want to do more. I like being a scientist, and I want to take my science beyond the lab. And so I Googled ocean like advocacy, and I happened upon this group called Sustainable Ocean Alliance that I got involved with, and it's really allowed me to be an advocate outside of being a scientist, which I think is a really integral part of what it means to be a scientist. I think we have a responsibility to get our work to the people, especially if they're the ones paying the taxes that fund our science. But this is like some of the pictures of some of the engagements I've done with Ocean Alliance. So they've sent me to Capitol Hill Ocean Week to engage with members of Congress. I got to work with our organization. So Nilly and I were a part of the Sustainable Ocean Alliance Pacific Northwest Hub, and now I'm a part of the Sustainable Ocean Alliance DMV Hub now that I'm in DC. We were able to plan a deep sea conservation festival to bring awareness to different parts of the ocean. I got to like go to all these amazing convenings such as Our Ocean, was in Panama in 2023, and that was my first time being international and someone who grew up as a lake person. And then I got to go to this international ocean conference. It just like rocked my world and catalyzed my desire to want to do advocacy in the kind of like water climate nexus space. And it just like really helped me to build community and want to do more as a scientist. And so I want to talk about now about the deep sea. Let's bring this down to the deep sea. So one of the main things that Sustainable Ocean Alliance does is it has this global mission to defend the deep. So there's new technology being proposed called deep sea mining that basically wants to send these vacuum cleaner kind of like machines down to the bottom of the ocean to suck up these metal containing golf ball size balls called polymetallic nodules. So there's a picture of these balls on the right and like kind of the proposed machinery. The reason why they want to do this technology is because there are metals in the polymetallic nodules that could potentially be used to make electric vehicle batteries. So it's being proposed as a climate solution. But there's this interesting kind of battle between like ocean people and climate people because sometimes climate solutions are not good ocean solutions and vice versa. So I like to tell other people that like I am an ocean first climate advocate, so I want to make sure we prioritize the safety and sustainability of our ocean because without that we, as I described all the chemistry a little bit before, like we can't really regulate our climate without the ocean. And so now we're at the bottom of the deep sea trying to extract these metal nodules. But what that does when you pull those metal nodules up to the surface, it can release these toxic plumes. So you have like all these nodules that are sitting at the bottom of the ocean. You're scooping them up, but you're also scooping up lots of water. You're scooping up lots of sediment. You want to get rid of that sediment and water before you bring up your nodules to the surface. So in that process, you're dewatering all the sediment that was at the bottom, and it's containing lots of metals. It's containing just things that can irritate the light transparency in the water column, which could disrupt like the mating and the predation in the water column. So these are some of the ways that we are trying to bring attention to deep sea awareness or like deep sea creatures is like bringing awareness to this new technology. And so we kind of talked about how, I just want to make sure. Yeah, we kind of talked about how the algae in the water, they take up the CO2 and eventually become like this marine soil that comes down to the bottom of the deep sea. Well, that process isn't going to be feasible if you're disrupting the phytoplankton in the water along the way. So I just kind of want to highlight this whole ocean, atmosphere to ocean and ocean to atmosphere process that we talked about today. So the first things we talked about was like the carbon dioxide gets dissolved into the ocean. The phytoplankton then convert that into organic carbon via photosynthesis. And then the circle of life happens. The phytoplankton get consumed by prey. Then those prey get eaten by other prey. But then eventually end of life happens for marine creatures and their bodies deteriorate. And that sprinkles down as marine snow to the bottom of the seabed, where eventually that carbon gets sank for thousands of years. But when we talk about deep sea mining, it kind of disrupts this process from ocean to atmosphere. So in the deep sea, where we're trying to go down and people are trying to go down and pick up these polymetallic nodules, it's disrupting that seafloor that has the sediment that was supposed to be undisturbed for thousands of plus years. And along the way, you're releasing this toxic material that's been collected in the sediment. and it's like now disrupting the chemistries in the water column. So then the marine life, which we need to process the CO2, they're getting exposed to hazardous material, and it's threatening their quality of life and risking their eventual production because they're not able to exist anymore in the water column. And so after that, then you're not able to sequester the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere because you don't have any phytoplankton to convert the CO2 into organic carbon. So this is kind of the relationship that is being disrupted by this threat of deep sea mining. So I think that's all I have today. If anyone has any questions there before we get to talk about the art, I'm happy to take those. Cool.
Sorry, Mickey. I do have a question before Nell begins. So I know, for example, I've been talking to some just other artists and people that are interested in the ocean, and I think even though I like learning about the ocean and we're doing this reef chats, it was even hard for me sometimes to really fully understand the connection between atmosphere and ocean and
Yeah.
interconnected they are. So is there anything that you would like people to know, like something that they're like, if they could just know this, that'll spark their curiosity or their spark, the interest in this, or why this connection is important, or, something that you say, I kind of wish people knew more about this, that could maybe inspire them to know more.
Yeah, I think it really goes back to this like it's like ocean people and climate people are sometimes put against each other, which seems so silly because they need to be working together. And I think if climate people understood the ocean more, we could be working better together. In terms of like my area, so algae is it's estimated that algae produce like it's like 50 to 60% of the oxygen on the planet, which is more than like terrestrial plants. A lot of that oxygen is actually used in the ocean, so it doesn't necessarily get to us. But overall, all the oxygen that is produced on the planet, it's coming from our oceans, which is really powerful. And so even though algae are really small and we only hear about the bad guys in the air, they're doing good work out here. So I think that's what I would want people to know is like the ocean is doing most of the work for our climate, and climate and ocean people need to really work together.
Thank you.
There are no further questions for Mithi. I'll go ahead and get started. That was an incredible presentation, and I'm glad that there was so much interest, and I learned a lot from that. So thank you, Mithi. Hi everyone, my name is Nilanjana, or I go by Nili as well. Mithi came up with this slide title, which I absolutely love, How to Be Artsy. So just a brief introduction on myself. Give me one moment. I am originally from New Jersey and pursued a bachelor's in marine science and biology while I was there. And during that time, I was made aware of the live streamed ROV expeditions from the Nautilus Live organization and NOAA doing their Oceanus Explorer expeditions, and was just absolutely obsessed and could not get enough of getting exposure to the ecosystems and seamounts in the deep sea across the world. But my research interests are really varied, and through lots of twists and turns in my career, I transitioned to studying microbes and salmon parasites. So I'm currently pursuing a PhD at Oregon State University. And I am working with several hatcheries in the area to study the different pathogens that are microscopic but have such an immense impact on their ability to raise healthy fish and support and supplement declining salmon populations here in the Pacific Northwest. And I just was really fascinated by the diversity and the morphology of these different microbes. And given that they are pretty inaccessible to the average person unless you have a microscope and are cutting open dead fish all the time, you just don't know the different microbes that are having such an important role in what they look like. And I had the opportunity to make the invisible visible with a art science fellowship through Oregon State University's Pratt Center for the Creative Arts. And my idea took so many different turns in how I wanted to bring this area of research and microbiology to the public, but I figured I just need to make these tiny little guys really big and try and immerse people in this sort of unseen parasite soup that our salmonid species are swimming through constantly in our local rivers and streams. And I just find that that's sort of my where a lot of my excitement comes from at the intersection of art and science is bringing some of these inaccessible areas of science and research and our natural environments to the public. And I was really fortunate to be able to connect with Megan, who is on the call today and was previously on an episode of the Reef Chat at the Deep Sea Conservation Festival that Mickey mentioned earlier. And she had partnered with two other really amazing women and science artists to form the Unseen Ocean Collective, that I am now a member of. And our main mission is to highlight these inaccessible and unseen areas of the deep sea in the Gulf of Alaska. And so despite my research interests having transitioned to microbes and parasites, I'm really grateful to be able to tap into my marine science background and interest in the deep sea with this group. And so the region that we're hoping to highlight with the help and assistance of our lead scientist, Laura, is the deep sea ecosystems in the Gulf of Alaska. There are a number of different habitats that have been discovered through these expeditions, like sponge gardens, where there are carnivorous sponges, there are sponges made of glass, and then also coral forests, where there's just an incredible diversity and density of different coral species that support crabs, fish, lots and lots of brittle stars and other invertebrates, shrimp, and a lot of things that make up the base of the food chain that feeds into some of the commercial and recreational fisheries elsewhere in the Gulf of Alaska. So really incredible environments that I'm grateful to be able to study through participating in this art science initiative. And these are some of the works in progress, and just trying to highlight some of the species that I find to be so incredible and exciting, and try and make them accessible to the public through gallery installations. And this is a sea pen, and they even glow in the dark. And this is not something I would have known about unless I was working on this project. And they're so fascinating, and there's so much more that needs to be examined and explored. Some additional species I'm currently working on in advance of our second gallery installation, which will be in Juneau, Alaska in February. Several carnivorous sponges, some invertebrates atop a bubblegum coral that you can see there. But I'm excited to make as many species as possible. And just wanted to leave you with this idea that that little person with a flashlight is essentially how we're navigating the deep sea with one ROV expedition at a time. And we're able to see little glimpses of what might be on a seamount, but there's so much more that we haven't yet shined any light on. And I'm really excited to see what we find as time goes on and with further support of ocean exploration.
Thank you, Nellie. I have a question for you. So it's really interesting, the intersection of art and science, right? And so what is your hopes in continuing with this path that it's combining art and science for you, right? You're both an artist and scientist at the same time. And so how does this change for you, or how does one in your personal experience feed into the other, and you going forward on this adventure for you and your interests?
Yeah, thank you so much, Frida. That's a great question. And it's constantly evolving. I think when I started with art and science, there was this emphasis on use it to maybe explain data that might be really convoluted. And I think that art can be a really great way to break a complex figure that you might see in a research paper into more bite-sized chunks, and in a visually engaging way where it's not just black and white and as much data packed into one figure as possible, but um, can be yeah, just more visually appealing. And that was the start of me trying to incorporate my creative side into science and vice versa. But at this point, I really appreciate the way that immersive installations can start conversations. Um, I think with the parasites, it was just so fascinating to have people walk through a gallery space and be like, these are beautiful. What are they? And they're parasites. And that's not a perspective that anyone would typically have based on what we know about parasites, but they are beautiful and they didn't necessarily choose to be parasitic. They just are microbes that have developed this parasitic lifestyle. And this will be the one time I will plug that not all parasites are bad, because I can have parasites right now and not know I'm function totally normally. And there's other parasites that might not have evolved to coexist with their host as much yet. And so they're causing a lot of problems. They might cause illness or mortality. So those are the ones that we want to keep an eye on and treat and study, but they're everywhere, and they're really diverse and deserve just as much attention as the algae in the air and in the ocean, all these other microbes that are, yeah, incredible and so hard to see unless you have a microscope or know where to look. So yeah, getting people curious, starting conversations, and yeah, exposing people to what is otherwise inaccessible. Roxanne, you had your hand up.
Thanks. Yeah, I was wondering where you're finding support, like to fund your artistic endeavors, because I'm really interested, like you said, about the immersive installations, and I've been to the Juneau Museum. There was a really cool exhibit about forests. Um, and yeah, so I'm wondering, are you getting more support locally to like work on these projects, or are there bigger foundations that you're reaching out to?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for the first gallery installation, that was through a fellowship through the Oregon State University Prac Center. And they have really solidified their stance that they want to support the intersection of art and science. So they have a number of different fellowships for faculty and artists, for local artists who are not associated with the university, for students and faculty, students and community-based artists. So there's centers like that in Oregon that I'm aware of, like um, the Playa residency and program, and Sitka Center for Ecology and art have a very specific art and science focus, and they provide workshops, residencies, scholarships, things like that. And then working with Megan and the rest of the Unseen Ocean Collective has been really insightful for me, because they have applied for a number of grants. And Megan, do you want to chime in a little bit about that process? You're still on here.
Yeah, sure. We have three different grants going on right now. The first one was a cultural grant that came from Germany, I believe, and that was a super open-ended one. The second grant that we got was through the British Ecological Society, and that was more of a science-based grant, but we told them, like, hey, we're doing this crossover project. They were very excited about it. The third grant we have going on is a Spokane-based grant from the Spokane Arts Grants Award. And that's very local. And so we're using that for everything that's happening in Spokane or what we're bringing to Spokane. That one's pretty exciting because it gets a ton of community support. So they're really public about it. And so when somebody knows that you're doing it, then they start reaching out and you get sort of more side projects going on, which can be great, can be expensive if you're an expensive person who likes projects. So anyway, kind of depending on where you're living, I'm not sure what state you're in, but if you're in Washington State, Arts Washington, Arts WA is like a home for where a lot of grants can happen. So
Awesome, thank you. I live in New Zealand, but I'm from California, So I'm just yeah, I'll probably message you after if that's okay to just learn more nerdy stuff about funding.
Yeah, that's okay if you message me or Nilly. And then I actually have a contact in New Zealand that you could maybe connect with as well. So,
Yay, thank you.
And so, Nelly, I have a similar question for you as I did Mickey. So, since you're at this crossovers of knowing the science, right, and the art, what is something that you wish people could know, right? I think I found really funny how you're like, not all parasites are bad parasites, because that's how I
Yeah,
feel about deep sea creatures. I'm like,
right.
if you think pugs are cute, you can find a deep sea creature that you like. You know, they can be ugly cute. And so, what is something that you would just love for people to know from your point of view?
Yeah, I think organisms on our planet can take forms that you would have never expected. I think that I'm working right now on a ping pong sponge, and it blew my mind. Megan has made an incredible painting. If you follow her on Instagram, Studio MPJ, of the ping pong sponge, and it's just like a stalked creature with like all these orbs all over it that like glow and luminesce when you shine a bright light on it. And they're carnivorous, so they have all these spines on their stem, and they're literally just standing in the current, and whatever little shrimp or plankton gets speared on to those tiny microscopic spines is its dinner. And I just think it's fascinating, and not something I would have known unless I um was reached out to by the scientist who specializes in them. So I think ask your local scientists questions about what they're obsessed with, and you will just find that they are excited about so many things that haven't been in the media, like aren't on, like you don't see photos of them otherwise because they just haven't been publicized. But they're out there and they're exciting. So yeah, that's what I would say. Megan, you had your hand up.
yeah, baby. I know we talk all the time, but we never get to talk about fun stuff. We just talk about
Uh-huh.
work stuff. Okay, let's talk about materials because I know your previous work, you've done a ton of work with like paper and wire, right? And we sort of talked about you doing that, but you're going in a different direction.
Mhm.
So, how are you investigating your materials? Are you just like hitting the craft store, picking it up, manipulating it, figuring it out? Are you researching? Or like, how does that process work for you?
Yeah, I love this question because so often I'm reminded how similar the process of science and my process of sculpture are similar. I call myself a mixed media or multimedia artist because I will just use whatever I find, and if it has the right shape or the right quality, and I feel like I can glue it together in the right way, like it's up for grabs. And um, so when I started out sculpting, which was in undergrad, just doing like this craft activity with friends, I realized I just love the tactile sensation of working with clay, and it sort of came naturally to me. And then I was just making miniature figurines for a while with polymer clay. But the Prax Fellowship during graduate school was the first time I was given the space to like make something for display. And I was like, I want these microbes to be hanging, suspended in space, but I can't do that with something heavy. And I went on Pinterest and I saw like paper lanterns and was like, what if I could make microbes with that material because it would be translucent the way the microbes are. I could really customize the shape and things like that. And I learned a lot in that process, like how to add this thin paper coating to the reed without it all shriveling and disfiguring itself during the drying process. And that was multiple experiments, just the same way that I would do something in the lab, trying to understand more about an organism. And then now I'm making these opaque creatures that also need to be sturdy enough to travel between multiple galleries. And so I am learning how to metalwork and how to try and weld. And I'm learning how to use other translucent materials like resins and environmentally friendly resins to give things this yeah, their translucent appearance to stay true to how they are in the deep sea, but some structural integrity so that they survive in order to make it to the public. Um, so yeah, lots of tests, lots of things are ugly the first couple times I make them, and you just make minor tweaks, change one thing at a time, the same thing you would do in an experiment. So yeah.
Is your play like where's your play? Is your play in
Yeah.
thinking about what you could use? Is it searching it out? Is it trying all the different varieties? So what part's your favorite, or do you like all of it?
Yeah, you asked earlier if I'm doing research, and the answer is yes, because I am a broke grad student and I can't spend money on things that ultimately will become useless. So much YouTube, so much like hearing and reading about other artists' materials. And then I get scared sometimes, and like the metalworking took me a while to try because there's a blowtorch involved. I'm doing it in my garage, like I don't want to set things on fire. Um, so there's a lot of research and a lot of thinking and visualizing how it's going to work and all my fallback, and then trying it and hoping it goes well. And most of the time it does. It might not be pretty, but yeah, it takes practice.
We were so impressed. So my kids and I all like scroll Instagram in the morning. And when that video came up of like the metalwork with the blowtorch, both my boys were like, whoa.
Yeah.
You know, we were so
Yeah.
impressed. It was amazing.
Yeah, and I will say having mentors is really key because I made those parasite sculptures and they're like, this would translate really well to metal and like a steel armature. And I was like, what are you talking about? How am I going to make a steel armature? Like, yeah, and so I think just allowing myself to believe that that might be possible and that I'm capable of new techniques and things that seem scary is important. And yeah, just seeking out lots of experts in the field to ask them how to have it go well.
Lily, I think it's kind of funny how you started your obsession watching ROVs and just you explaining how you're trying to be faithful to these creatures but sturdy enough to survive the transition. Kind of reminds me how scientists have to do the same thing, like bringing things up and making sure like it all maintains its shape. So it's kind of like a little bit of a parallel going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Um, yeah, we'll see. And the solutions that I'm coming up with, like, will probably have to be adapted. I shipped my first sculpture internationally, and there were some cracks along the way. So I learned I need to maybe choose the box first and make the sculpture to fit inside. Because I was like, okay, now I need to find a box, and the one I had around my house was maybe not the best option. That's okay. It was a prototype. I'll learn for the next one. And yeah, that's been another question for a lot of artists on Instagram who make delicate sculptures. I reached out and was like, and how are you shipping these exactly? And they've been really open and helpful, which I appreciate. So yeah. Yeah, Isabel?
Yeah, just was wondering if you design any public interaction, and maybe this is partly to Megan too for other projects, but like does the community become part of the display sometimes through their interaction or things they post or say, or, do you have any concepts about that or think that's effective?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And something that we're working on in the Unseen Ocean Collective is doing a sort of scavenger hunt with our future exhibits because it's essentially the same as scientists watching the ROV footage, is how many species can we spot and what genus is present here in this seamount. And so we'll have people come into the installation and artwork, the paintings, all the 2D work and ROV footage, and how many shrimp can you count? How many different types of coral are present? And yeah, just what organisms are using these corals as a habitat and have them really take a second look and look at the entire community as opposed to just looking at it as a nice piece of art, I think will be really essential to give them the perspective of what these scientists are experiencing while they're watching the ROV footage live and in their future research endeavors.
Yeah, great.
I have a question about that. before I know we're getting closer to the end, but you mentioned how some of these creatures, plants, animals, everything that lives in there, some of them glow in the dark, right? And so, do you guys have something to where if people go through the installation, if you have, those like lamps or UV things that if you shine things on them to try and figure out which ones glow and which ones don't?
We have not, but it's been in the back of my mind, and I think that that could definitely happen. I mean, we're thinking about all different kinds of lighting, and we could absolutely incorporate a specific sort of zone where that can be the exploration that you embark upon. So I would love to do that, and I love that idea.
Yeah, that's a pretty rad idea, Frida. I like
Yeah.
that.
Big fan. We've been talking about how the gallery exhibit will evolve in the future, and
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by not only the benthic habitats that we're focusing on right now, but also things that are in the water column. There's so many different jellies, salps, siphonophores, swimming shrimp, swimming everything. So I think that would be also really exciting to portray in the future. Roxanne, I see your hand.
Would you ever want to go in a deep sea submersible to like see this firsthand and maybe like the bioluminescence and things like that that are kind of hard to translate based on the technology we have now?
Oh yeah, that would be a dream come true. And currently I'm vicariously living through a fellow friend and graduate student Dexter Davis, who's also an artist, and he's been in the Alvin submersible like 3 or 4 times, and I think 2 years ago spent 107 days at sea. So he is in the world, like he is in that life, living it and studying the deep sea. And so I am really grateful for the science communication that he's doing so that I can sort of see what that's like. But if I was able to do that, that would be, yeah, a bucket list item for sure.
Okay, guys, any last questions, comments, concerns?
Since it's such a small group, I don't mind speaking up and saying that I've got my daughter in the background and she's 12 and she's an artist and wants to be a marine biologist. So if anybody has any words of wisdom or inspiration to point her into this trifecta of where marine science and art meet together, what have you got to tell us?
I'll go ahead and say, yeah, just play with materials, and like I think, yeah, definitely dive in headfirst to your interests. I spent a lot of time watching the ROV footage. I spent a lot of time watching interviews online of people who are marine biologists and the steps they took in their career. And there's 100 different ways to end up in this field, but you have to have the passion. You don't have to have straight A's. You can have subjects that you're better at than others, and that's okay because I think what really drives you in the field is continuing to be interested and putting your best foot forward. So ask tons of questions, volunteer. There's paid opportunities and internships that you can get as well. So yeah, stay interested, stay curious. And for art and science, I think figure out what materials you like, what is fun to you, and as you try and make art related to your interests, you'll learn about both sides, um, both fields. And yeah, so
Thank
play
you.
and yeah, explore.
Isabel, did you have a hand up?
Oh, yeah. I was just saying that I'd gone to some dock lightings up here on the island where I live. And so kind of what I'd sort of held back that idea, but what Freya mentioned, and I just thought that would be really amazing to be part of an exhibit if there was some place where you don't see anything until a light shines on it, and then the colors are so phenomenal, and the what do you call it? The effervescent, the when
Yeah, the
Bioluminescent.
bio
iridescence.
the
Yeah,
bioluminescence, and I don't know how you would simulate that, but it just comes alive in a new way. And it's like this discovery process, like, oh, that's in here, this water that I see every day, like amazing, amazing
yeah.
creatures.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's just so exciting that we can do this on so many different scales from
Yeah.
the microscopic to macroscopic. I would absolutely love to do that, and go night lighting is also on my bucket list. I came to grad school in Oregon from New Jersey because I just had to be close to tide pools, and night
Right.
lighting is next because yeah, it's an incredible world and there's just so much to see.
Thank you. That was just so fantastic. Great.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for all of your questions.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you to Mickey and Nilly. I also want to mention that John couldn't be with us here today, but I do want to mention that the Sustainable Ocean Alliance does have their Deep Sea Academy. If you want to learn more about that, we always post a link to that. We will post the recording of the chat where you can find Mickey and Nilly as well. And thank you so much for everybody being here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. That was really fun.
Yay. Happy holidays all.
Happy holidays.